Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this special program titled 21st Century Challenges in Douglas Fir Forest, an interview with Jerry Franklin. My name is Van Bobbitt. I'm past president of the Washington Native Plant Society, and I want to welcome you to this special event for Native Plant Appreciation Month. The Washington Native Plant Society is hosting a wide variety of activities this month to celebrate native plants. They include webinars, classes, plant sales, field trips, and volunteer activities. You can find more information at our website, wnps.org. The mission of the Washington Native Plant Society is to promote the appreciation and conservation of Washington's native plants and their habitats through study, education, and advocacy. If you're already a member, we thank you for your support. If you'd like to become a member, please consider joining. Membership in the Washington Native Plant Society supports native plant conservation and education. It also connects you with native plant enthusiasts in your neighborhood and across the state. Please go to our website, again, wnps.org, to join as a member and learn more about our work. I'm especially honored tonight to introduce Clay Antieau, who will be interviewing Jerry Franklin this evening. Clay is a horticulturist, botanist, wetland scientist, and ecological restorationist with more than 40 years of experience in Pacific Northwest ecosystems and their flora. He's been employed with Seattle Public Utilities since 2000 and is a longtime instructor and advisor with the University of Washington's Continuum College's certificate program in wetland science and management. He's a fellow, past president, and past chapter chair of the Washington Native Plant Society, and past president of the Northwest chapter for the Society for Ecological Restoration. In 1987, he took Jerry Franklin's landscape ecology course, and he found Jerry's personalized tour of his Wind River Canopy Crane project to be a, I quote, mind-altering experience. And he meant that in a good way. With no further ado, I'll turn the program over to Clay.
Great, thank you, Van. It's my honor and pleasure to participate in this event today. This interview will go for about an hour, maybe a little longer. And I'll just mention that there should be some time for questions from you all at the end of this event. I'm being assisted in that by Dr. Jim Erkman, who will be basically moderating the Q&A session. I would ask that you put your questions in the Q&A, and if you have any comments, personal insights, you can put those in the chat. Just to make Jim's job easier, just put your questions in the Q&A, and he will moderate that Q&A session at the end of our interview with Jerry. Jim is a member of the Board of Trustees with Bridle Trails Park Foundation and a retired watershed ecosystems manager for the city of Seattle, formerly stationed up at the Cedar River Municipal Watershed. Thank you, Jim, for your assistance tonight. So tonight's topic is 21st century challenges in Douglas Fir Forest, and I'll start by briefly introducing Jerry Franklin, and then we'll get into some discussion about that topic. Jerry Franklin is Emeritus Professor of Forest Ecology at the University of Washington. He received his BS and MS degrees in Forest Management from the Oregon State University and a PhD in Botany and Soils from Washington State University. He worked in the USDA Forest Service Pacific Northwest Station for nearly 35 years as a research scientist, a project leader, and chief plant ecologist before retiring and moving to the University of Washington as a professor of ecosystem science in 1986. He then retired again from the University of Washington in January of 2018 after 32 years of service there. He was also a program director for ecosystem studies at the National Science Foundation 1973 to 1975 and chairman of the long-term ecological research coordinating committee and director from 1982 to 1996, among many other activities. His research is focused largely on community ecology, the relationship between structure and function of forest ecosystems, ecosystem responses to natural disturbances, for example, at Mount St. Helens, ecology and restoration of frequent fire forest ecosystems, and application of ecological knowledge in policy and management of federal forest lands. With a career spanning 6 decades, Dr. Franklin has witnessed dramatic changes in forest management concepts and has provided critical research, insights, and guidance along the way. And we are excited to probe that knowledge in tonight's session. So, Jerry, I think I'll just start out with, I know a topic that's dear to your heart, and that is the Northwest Forest Plan. I'll just briefly describe what that is for our listeners today. The Northwest Forest Plan was adopted in 1994 with the intent of protecting critical habitat of the northern spotted owl while maintaining a viable forest products industry in the Pacific Northwest. And you were an author of that plan, which has guided management of 19 federal forests and 7 Bureau of Land Management, Land and Resource Management plans in the US Pacific Northwest for the past 28 years. Currently, the US Forest Service is looking at those existing management plans for possible revision. And that's under their 2012 planning rule. So this is a great time to ask you, what changes would you contemplate or advise as the US Forest Service begins to contemplate revising the Northwest Forest Plan?
Well, thank you, Clay, and thank you to the Native Plant Society for inviting me here tonight. Now, in terms of, what would I change? There's probably a lot that I'd change now, based on the experience that we've had. We've now had over 20 years since the plan was adopted. But I think the most important thing that needs to be done is that there were a lot of mature and old forests that were left out of the reserve system. So when we did the Northwest Forest Plan, we created a very extensive series of late successional reserves focused on trying to set aside and protect the very best of the remaining old forests, as well as the mature forests, which typically are 100 to 200 years old. And at the same time, based on the direction from President Clinton, we left out several million acres of mature and old forests in what we call the matrix, with the expectation that they would be provide the source of timber harvest until the plantations were completely mature. And looking back on it, we weren't asked to preserve all of the old growth forest, but it would have been a very wise thing if we'd done that. And so in the revision of the Northwest Forest Plan, the first thing that I would say is, okay, let's make sure to reserve from any harvest all of the remaining mature and old forests on the federal lands in the Northwest. And so that would be one thing. A second thing that I'd do, we knew, the Northwest Forest Plan did include some areas on the east side of the Cascades, the pine and mixed conifer forests over there. And we, in the plan, provided an opportunity for land managers to restore those to we can call it a healthier condition, a condition where they would be much more resistant to fire. And we didn't really emphasize that enough. And so one of the other things that should be done in revision of the plan is to make clear that we're going to save the old trees in the frequent fire forests, the pine and the mixed conifer, but that a lot of those need to be restored to a more resistant and resilient condition by thinning in the use of prescribed fire. So those are two major things. One other thing
go ahead.
just mention is that we thought that our plan would result in protection and would result in recovery of the northern spotted owl populations. And that was an assumption on our part that has not worked out. Typically, you think if you provide habitat, a bird like the spotted owl will be able to recover. And we provided a lot of habitat, but we have a problem with a very invasive owl from the east, the barred owl, which is causing the extinction, almost certainly the eventual extinction of the spotted owl, unless something is explicitly done about the barred owl. And so it's not really related to the revision of the Northwest Forest Plan, but it is a major challenge in the management of the federal forests in the Northwest. How are we going to deal with the barred owl so that we can prevent the extinction of the northern spotted owl?
So things have changed pretty dramatically in those 30 years that have passed. And sort of reading between the lines, it would seem that the Northwest Forest Plan doesn't really focus so much anymore, or perhaps shouldn't, on the northern spotted owl and its conservation. So why your emphasis on protecting mature and old forests if the northern spotted owl might be, as some people suggest, a hopeless cause?
Well, in the first place, old growth forests are not just about the northern spotted owl. There are many other organisms that depend on and utilize those forest systems. And so the Northwest Forest Plan wasn't just focused on the spotted owl, but it was in fact designed in fact to provide habitat for the full array of species that are a part of an old growth forest. And we would still want to do that. Even if we lost the spotted owl. But more profoundly, one of the things that we've really become interested in as a result of climate change is carbon sequestration, the storage of carbon by forests. And the mature and old forests are the greatest storehouses of carbon that we've got. And if you cut one of those forests, you end up releasing a great deal of this carbon that was stored previously within the forest. So there's no reason ecologically to harvest any more of those forests. And there's every reason in the world from the standpoint of habitat and from the standpoint of carbon storage to retain those forests in the conditions that they are. And they also, the naturally regenerated mature and old forests that we've got that remain are in fact the only truly complete forest systems that we have anymore, because we've altered everything else through processes of cutting down the old growth and converting them to plantations. And the plantations are not complete ecosystems. They were never intended to be, they aren't designed to be. They were in fact designed to maximize wood production for timber harvest. And so we have a real challenge in terms of what we're going to do with those plantations in this century, but more profoundly, since the mature and old forests are truly complete forest ecosystems, we should essentially keep those that we've got, not cut any more of them.
Let me explore that tension that seems to perpetually exist between conservation and economics. And I'll just point to your foundational 1989 piece in American Forest titled A New Forestry, where you pose the question, is there an alternative to the stark choice between tree farms and total preservation? Jumping ahead to 2022, it still feels like economic objectives outweigh or continually threaten to outweigh other forest management objectives. As we're seeing, for example, in British Columbia, where they're hell-bent on cutting basically all of their old growth and mature forests. We're seeing increasing pressures on old and mature forests and national forests in Oregon. For example, that project you're involved in, the Flat Country Project. Realistically, can forests be managed for both economic objectives and a diverse suite of physical, chemical, and biological objectives? Or is it really an either-or situation?
It's not an either-or situation. It really never has been an either-or situation. We have an incredible understanding of these forest systems today, and we can understand very clearly how we can manage those for a full array of values: ecological, economic, and cultural. And the problem is that if you go back 50, 60 years, foresters were really thinking about these forests as being collections of trees that you manage for wood production. And of course, in order to manage them very efficiently for wood production, you converted the natural forest into plantations where you could maximize wood production. And as we've learned more and more about these forest systems and how they go together, and believe me, we didn't know much at all back in the mid-21st century. And we really didn't know much about them at that time. But as we've learned more and more, we've come to understand the importance of the structural complexity that's present in those forests. And we can duplicate much of that complexity, much of that richness. So it's possible to manage these forests so that you sustain all of their capabilities, all of their functional capacities, and that includes economic wood production. So, and we see, in fact, more and more ownerships beginning to try to do that. If you take Washington DNR lands, for example, one of the things that DNR is beginning to do is use more and more ecological principles in their management of these forests. And it's a very challenging thing because you're changing from a sole emphasis on economics to, in fact, a goal of multiple outputs from these systems. But it can be done. And we just wrote a book about how you can do this sort of thing. And it just means that you manage them in a more, well, you manage them in a way that's more conscious of the complexities, the importance of the different parts of those systems, and you keep those as part of your managed forest rather than simply rejecting them. And just a very simple example, all natural forests always have they have significant amounts of dead wood, standing dead trees and downed logs. And the production forester thinks of that as being unhealthy. And as a young forester, I learned, that a tree dies, it has no value anymore to the system. It's a waste, it's a fire hazard, it's an impediment, get rid of it. But what we learned as we studied the forest ecosystems of the Northwest is no, the dead tree is very, very important in these systems. And it does a lot of things such as providing habitat. And a vast array of animals that live in these forests utilize dead wood in one form or another. So a healthy forest from an ecological perspective will have some standing dead and down material as part of that system. And we can very easily do that as part of a managed forest. So no, it is not a black and white. You either have to have a plantation or on the other hand, you have to preserve it. And in fact of matter, our real challenge is to become very skillful at managing forests in a way that sustains all of its capabilities. And it's easy, I won't say it's easy to do, but it is very possible to do that. It just means that you have to give up the idea of maximizing one output, wood. And that's one of the reasons why natural forests can carry out so many functions is nature doesn't tend to maximize anything. And as a consequence of that, it's capable of doing a whole lot of valuable work for us simultaneously. So we have the techniques to do it.
Mm-hmm. So in your experience, do you feel that that dichotomy between how a production forester views forest health and how a forest ecosystem sciences views forest health, is that softening in practice, and particularly at the private timberland scale?
It depends on the private timberland owner. Now, you know, in the United States, about half of the forests are owned by small non-industrial private forest landowners. And they are adopting a lot of these kinds of practices as they learn about them, because those landowners as a group do not put income or economics at the top of the list and why they have those forests and why they manage and value those forests. So for a vast number of forest owners, these kinds of strategies that integrate ecological and economic objectives are very attractive. They've just the foresters haven't proposed those sorts of things earlier. And of course, on public lands, on federal lands, on state lands, community, many reservations, these kinds of principles are being utilized now in increasing amounts. So, for example, under the Northwest Forest Plan, one of the things that went into that plan was that you can no longer cut everything. You can no longer clear cut on federal lands in the Northwest. You have to retain a significant amount of trees from the pre-existing forest. You can't take it all. And you also have to provide for snags and down logs as part of it. And so similarly, the DNR is doing more and more of this kind of activity. So anyway, it's very practical to do it. And the only people who are not currently interested in this kind of activity are the owners of the old, what were the industrial forest lands, which are now owned mostly by TIMOs, Timber Investment Management Organizations, or real estate investment trusts, REITs. Those lands are managed primarily to maximize return on capital. They aren't even managed to maximize wood production, but simply return on capital. And so ecological objectives, environmental objectives has very little role to play on those lands currently, except with regards to protection of stream and river systems. And in the state of Washington, we have, a fish forestry agreement that's made a very significant difference, even on the old industrial forest lands.
Great, thank you. Let's turn our attentions to what you referred to in your publications as frequent fire forest or dry forest. And I think all of us realize that there's broad scientific consensus now regarding an urgent need for massive efforts to restore resilience to those forests and landscapes historically characterized by the occurrence of frequent low to mixed severity wildfire. And typically the important elements of this consensus include a need to focus on managing fuels, as well as plans and implementation at very large spatial scales. So the question to you is, how does society address this restoration challenge, considering the massive effort and vast resources required and the inherent complexity arising from stakeholder needs that cross environmental, socioeconomic, and governance boundaries? How do we manage this problem?
Well, we are managing it. And, DNR, Washington Department of Natural Resources in Washington, has been a major leader in this in collaboration with the United States Forest Service. And so we see now multi-owner, multi-agency programs on the east side, explicitly focused on restoring forest systems to a condition that will be both resistant to fire and resilient following fire. And of course, this all has to do with what I began by calling dry forest, because they are dry here, but a better description of them is forests that historically were subject to frequent fire. And because they had very frequent fire, they had a structure, an architecture, and a composition that was very resistant to fire. Fire had no significant impact on those systems at all. They were low density forests dominated by a relatively few large old trees. And our challenge is to try to restore as many of those historic forest lands as possible to a condition where they can once again resist fire. And we've developed a very effective approach to it. This last year, I had my own proposals for how to do this got an acid test down here in Oregon. We had a big fire called a bootleg fire, and it burned hundreds of thousands of acres of ponderosa pine and lodgepole pine over in the Klamath country, Klamath Lake country. And we had been working with I had been working with some others with the Klamath tribe, developing a restoration strategy that focused, first of all, on retaining all old trees. So if you had some old trees, the first thing you did was you kept those and cleared around them, eliminated fuels and competition, and then you thinned the rest of the forest. And then hopefully, after you were done with the mechanical treatment, the thinning, you then did a prescribed burn. So we, several hundreds of acres of this was carried out on the historic Klamath Indian Reservation. And the bootleg fire came along. And it turned out the Forest Service, who actually manages this land, because it became a part of the Wainema National Forest, but that's another story. We had applied this thinning treatment to this area, hundreds of acres of it. And then the Forest Service had come in and they had done a prescribed burn underneath it. And so in the middle of hundreds of thousands of acres of black was this green patch. And it was the area that had been thinned and prescribed burned. And so we know this works, and it works well. And we see in both Eastern Washington and in Eastern Oregon, very aggressive programs of restoration. And we know that they work, but one of the lessons that we learned was that you also need to not just thin, but also reintroduce fire. You really need to do prescribed fire. And interestingly, the bootleg fire burned through these areas, but they didn't kill anything. They didn't kill any of the big trees at all. All they did was just improve the fuel loading that much more. So it was just like frosting on a cake. There's a lot to be done, but in some cases, in many cases, you can actually pay for this restoration treatment with wood that you take off of the forest. And that was one of the ways that, in fact, some of those treatments were paid for down in the Klamath country. So I'm very optimistic about restoration. We do have to bear in mind there's some areas that we'll never get to. We can't. But there are hundreds of thousands of acres that we can. And we are moving very aggressively on this. I'm very pleased with what's happening.
It sounds like you're optimistic that this can be scaled up at or to the scale that is required to really begin to manage.
You bet,
these
absolutely can be. And the interesting thing is the states of Washington and Oregon are moving much more rapidly than California. It's been interesting, and part of that has been there's been so much social controversy in California that hasn't resolved itself, whereas we've pretty much decided what we're going to do up here in the Pacific Northwest with these frequent fire systems. And one of the keys, again, was a decision in restoring them. You never take an old tree. All the old trees stay because they are the ecological backbone for the system. And they're also the iconic trees from the standpoint of society. We love those big old yellow pines. And so it works ecologically and it works socially.
You have made a distinction in the past between old trees and large trees. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, that was one of the things working with the Klamath tribe that became very apparent. Where you have a mixed conifer forest, you have a forest of pine and for example, grand fir or white fir. With the elimination of fire, the fir, which is typically fire sensitive, can come in and it grows very fast. And so you can get a pretty good sized 2-foot diameter grand fir in 80 years on these sites. They grow really fast. They don't live very long, but they grow really fast. And those kinds of trees provide fuel ladders into the big old trees. And so one of the things that you want to do when you're doing restoration and you want to try to keep those fire resistant old trees in place is you don't want leaving a big grand fir under it that's young, that is going to produce a fire ladder right up into the top of the big pine. And so sometimes it's necessary to remove some relatively large trees, but they're young trees. And they are a potential danger to the old trees, which are the ones that you really want to save. So sometimes you do have to remove a larger tree. And that's why we emphasize old. The other thing about it is for a long time, there was a 21-inch diameter limit on national forest lands. And the rule was you couldn't take anything over 21 inches. And the problem there was that a lot of the old trees in these dry forests are small. They aren't 24 inches in diameter. They are maybe 16, 18 inches in diameter, and they were going down the road in the back of a pickup, or back of a logging truck. So from several points of view, our restoration strategy always starts with sustaining, keeping the existing old trees, if you have any. Now, many places they've been taken out, there aren't any. But where they are, you start by keeping those.
Great. You have been interviewed about this situation, and you were asked the question, how do we sustain integrity of ecosystems in the face of climate change and invasive species? You replied, the question is, how do you maintain functionality, landscapes that still work? And then you went on to say, species are not so important in the future as having landscapes that still work. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that statement. Are you suggesting that the loss of biological diversity will be unavoidable collateral damage in this kind of intervention at that scale?
Well, I think what we're going to see at times are situations where, as a result of climate change, we have changes taking place in the plants and the animals, as a result of which they cannot survive there any longer. And very often, of course, the change is going to occur as a result of a disturbance, such as wildfire, taking out the old forest and creating, the challenge of, okay, what can grow there now? And so our greatest priority as a society is really going to be trying to maintain the functional capabilities of these forest systems, meaning their ability, for example, to protect a watershed and sustain a dependable, high-quality flow of well-regulated water. We don't want floods. And so anyway, my vision in the future, as things become more and more challenging, as species drop out as a result of climate change, that we're going to really be concerned with trying to maintain the ability of these forests to protect the watersheds, protect the soils, provide us with sequestration of carbon, and that's going to be a greater challenge than whether or not we sustain a particular species or a set of species. So yes, I'm saying that functionality is going to be the most important thing. We don't want to lose the capacity of those forests to provide the protective cover and the habitat that they do. And we're going to have to focus more of our attention and our energy on that, and often much less on individual species. It doesn't mean the biodiversity isn't important. It just means that we really, at times, are going to have to move species, for example, in order to sustain the kind of stability in that forest landscape that we want. I'm not sure I even made it clear with that, but
no, it was clear to me. That was, yes, thank you
Okay.
for that
Yeah.
response. For those areas, those dry forests, those frequent fire forests that have burned, there's often debate, controversy around salvage logging, taking the burned trees out of those places. And you've weighed in on that tension. In fact, you wrote a book about it, Salvage Logging and Its Ecological Consequences, with Lyndon Mayer and Burton. It was in 2008. And you made an interesting statement that timber salvage is most appropriately viewed as a tax on ecological recovery. So do you mind elaborating on your opinions on whether it's appropriate to salvage log after a fire?
Sure. And, I've sort of changed my position to some degree. But in general, let's take the west side. Let's take the west side Douglas fir forests. Those forests historically burned with high intensity fires that included a high severity component and generated a lot of dead wood. And so it was always characteristic of these Douglas fir forests to have that kind of fire and to have that kind of dead wood loading as a result, that legacy of dead wood. And so there's nothing unnatural about it at all. In fact, the system, as it recovers from the fire, is going to be utilizing that legacy of dead wood as critical habitat. So in a case like the Douglas fir forest, if we go in and salvage, we're actually removing something that the system needs as a part of its recovery process. And so we aren't helping recovery, we're just capturing some economic value. And sometimes we'll do it. And in that book, the one thing that we say right at the very beginning is, after a disturbance like a wildfire, the question you have to ask yourself is, what did I intend to do with that forest? And if you're a warehouser, for example, and it burns, well, you want another crop of trees. If on the federal lands, on the other hand, we're very interested in the full array of ecological functions, not just wood production. We're interested in wildlife habitat. And so it makes no sense, given our goals for the federal lands, to go in and salvage, because the system doesn't need our assistance. It's going to do just fine. The difference is on the fire frequent or the dry forest over on the east side, you now have forests with a lot more dead wood than they would have had historically, because the forests have become denser. You have an intense fire. You have an awful lot of dead wood that's left there as potential fuel. And particularly if you intend to, in the next generation of forests, use fire, prescribed fire in those systems, if you leave all of that dead wood there, it can be a really serious problem, make it very difficult to reintroduce fire. And so Norm Johnson and I developed this perspective that if you can, and if you wish to, it is probably worthwhile to go in and salvage some of the wood. But be sure to leave enough of the standing dead and down wood to meet the needs for the various organisms that live there. And we sort of talk about salvage, but salvage where you leave behind the same thing that you would have left behind if it was live as part of a restoration treatment. So in the frequent fire forest, I've altered my thinking in terms of salvage to think that it's perfectly okay to salvage, and maybe a good thing, as long as you also leave a significant amount of standing dead and down wood to provide for the habitat needs of the organisms. And it's going to make it easier for you then when you go to reintroduce fire into the system. And I really learned my lesson about this because of some work I do down in the longleaf pine in the southeast. And the longleaf pine is extraordinary. It is, it is what I call the bookend species for a frequent fire forest. Longleaf pine, you have to burn it every 2 or 3 years, or it begins to change into something else. And so in managing the longleaf pine forest, they're managed using fire on a very frequent basis. But what happens with a hurricane down there is you can end up with a whole lot of slash on the ground after a hurricane event. And if you don't do something about it, salvage it, clean it up, you can't use prescribed fire because it's going to kill the surviving standing trees. And so that was where I realized, oh, Jerry, you don't know everything about everything. Guess what? There are times when you do need to salvage, but it isn't the case in our Douglas fir forest.
Great, thank you for that. I'll just remind our listeners that we're coming up on a question and answer period. So if you have questions, feel welcome to put those into the Q&A. Jerry, you've probably heard about initiatives around the world to plant trees as a way to deal with climate change. But natural regeneration has been sort of brought into that discussion. That is to say, allowing forests to reestablish themselves. And it's being argued to be a more cost-effective strategy for meeting ambitious forest restoration and climate change mitigation. What are your thoughts on that approach? Whether we should be actively planting forests or just letting things naturally regenerate? You've made a statement that leaving forests to deal without our participation is neither logical nor responsible.
Yeah, and I definitely feel that way in this century, that we really need to be collaborating with nature for the benefit of both the forest and our society. I really do feel that way. As far as regeneration is concerned, if in fact you're dealing with putting trees into a place where they've never been before, you're going to have to plant. It's not going to come naturally. But I was referring to situations like where we do timber harvest here in the Douglas fir region, for example. And I think that using natural regeneration has many advantages to it. And it almost always will come if in fact you're doing more of a retention harvesting kind of thing, as opposed to clear cutting. We stopped using natural regeneration primarily because it didn't come rapidly enough to satisfy the production foresters. And it didn't come uniformly enough. And so that's why they went to planting. But I'm proposing these days in managed forests on the west side that we use a combination of natural regeneration and artificial regeneration, where you would plant, for example, species that you don't have a seed source locally for. And I think it makes a lot of sense to do a very modest level of planting, but expect in fact that you're going to get a lot of natural regeneration as well. And my experience has been that wherever you leave even a modest number of green trees, just maybe half a dozen per acre, that in the Douglas fir region, you're going to get natural regeneration. It will happen. It is pretty dependable. But I think it makes a lot of sense to use both artificial and natural regeneration. And I would consider that to be a mark of a good ecological forester, that they're using both.
Excellent point. Great. One of my last questions for you before we go to the Q&A is your work with tribal peoples. You mentioned working with the Klamath folks. Stewardship ethic of Indigenous peoples is embedded in Indigenous ways of relating to land and embodies principles of respect, humility, reciprocity, and responsibility, themes that are often reflected in your speaking and writing. What are your thoughts on bringing Indigenous knowledge into balance with Western scientific knowledge as it relates to ecological forest management?
Well, I think it's very useful. And I think one of the things that you're getting with Indigenous knowledge is you're dealing with a people, a society that's had a long-term relationship with the forest system in which they're existing. And so they know things about it. They know things about the various plants and animals that are there that we don't necessarily know as scientists. And they've developed ways of relating to it. Usually, often they use fire historically in managing their forests. So I think there's a lot to be said for utilizing both Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. And scientific knowledge really brings benefits to them as well. And typically they recognize that, oh, there are some things that they didn't understand about the system, even though they knew how it worked. They didn't understand why it was working the way it was. And so the other thing about it is this Indigenous knowledge is not just knowledge in a technical or scientific sense. It's also the perspective on the system and the 7 generations perspective on it. So they do consider themselves very much to be a part of those systems and not apart from it. And so the respect that they have, the humility that they bring to their management is a very important part of that Indigenous perspective on management of those systems. And that's something that we really, really need to adopt in terms of our approach to the management of these resources, is some real humility, as in terms of appreciating how complex and how rich these systems are, and approaching them with genuine respect and humility rather than arrogance, which is really the way that we approach them historically. We know we're going to be really efficient. We're going to make this forest really produce wood, and we're going to make it go down this particular direction. And we did, but in the process of doing that, we lost so much in the way of other elements and functions in that system. And we want to be sure that we don't ever get ourselves into the position again where we're managing a forest ecosystem for just one objective, maximizing one objective. And that's what's wrong with the management of the industrial forest lands today. It's managed with one objective that happens to be return on capital. And as a consequence of that, those lands are socially underperforming lands. They don't provide nearly the array of functions, of values as they should be, as in, for example, sequestering carbon. So, but anyway, I'm very respectful of Indigenous people because they know whereof they live. And they also know that they have to live out the consequences of what they do. Now, I spent a lot of time in Indian country, which is what they refer to it as. And, they have to live out the consequences of the decisions they make. We don't. At least we're far removed from the immediate consequences of some of our decisions. They are not. So humility, pay attention. Yeah.
Words to remember. Right. Well, if you'll indulge us, I'll going to turn to Jim Erkman to see if we have any questions for you from our listeners, Jerry. You might be muted, Jim.
Now can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, sorry. We got two that are very similar. One is cutting old growth forest doesn't release carbon if it is turned into lumber. Isn't it better for sequestering carbon to foster faster growing trees?
Well, one way that I look at this, Jim, is you can think of it just for a minute as money or gold. And you know, when you've got a mature and old forest, you have this incredible capital. You have this incredible carbon accumulation out there. And it's still adding to that accumulation, but the cash flow is pretty low, but the capital is huge. The young forest is really cranking on really fast. Things are happening really fast. So it's got a much higher input, cash flow, if you wish, but it has essentially nothing in the way of capital. In other words, there's no accumulated carbon there. And so what would you rather have, particularly at this time? Would you rather have an ecosystem that has very, very little carbon sequestered, but it's taking it in really fast? Or would you rather have this forest that's got this immense accumulation of carbon and is still has a small amount of input going into it yet every year? It's not losing anything, it's just not gaining a whole lot more carbon. And the problem is, if you cash that capital in, if you go out and you cut that old forest, you end up releasing vast amounts of carbon. And it doesn't matter how much of it gets turned into lumber. Whatever it is, it's going to be a relatively small percentage of the logs that go down the road. You know, most of that wood is going to end up in paper and pulp, cardboard, pallets, things like that don't have a long lifespan. And so anyway, harvesting those forests releases to the atmosphere an immense amount of carbon, and the plantations can never catch up with it, can never get it back to where it was. So I want the old forest if I'm interested in carbon.
So here's one, and this is from Linda Mapes, who is our environmental journalist for the Seattle Times. What are your words for President Biden, who just arrived in Seattle?
Well, I'm a little disappointed with Mr. Biden from the standpoint of what he's proposing, as I understand it as of tonight, and not having, read his speech. But I was hoping that, this administration would take the initiative to essentially take the mature and old forests off the table as far as timber harvest is concerned, and focus on the hundreds of thousands of acres of plantations that we have in terms of active management. And it doesn't look like he's going to do that. So he is, in fact, as I understand it from what little I've seen, going to do an inventory. He's going to have the Forest Service and BLM do an inventory of how much mature and old do we have and where is it. But I think something much more definitive in terms of action might have been appropriate.
I have a question that was based on one that you addressed a while ago. You're talking about whether to foster natural regeneration or planting. And there's some concern. I've been in many discussions recently about planting, not just allowing natural regeneration, because the seed source is local, and the conditions in the future with climate change are likely to be different. So what do you think about, getting seedlings that are grown from seed sources that are more likely to be from habitats that are similar to what we expect in the future?
Well, that's a fairly complex subject, but I would say a prudent manager will do both. Will provide for significant natural regeneration, essentially the existing germplasm that's on the site and has been for a long time, and probably use some artificial regeneration as well. And if you're going to do that, taking it from a different seed source that you think is going to be better adapted, makes sense to do that. However, you can argue that the genetics of the natural regeneration may be superior to that of the plantation of the planted trees, simply because the planted trees are grown under conditions where selection is for growth rather than for ability to resist difficult environmental conditions. And so, a prudent manager hedges the bet and has both natural regeneration and some artificial regeneration, including probably some additional tree species that may not have a presence currently on the site.
Oh, so you're saying that you might plant some things that are not native to that particular location?
No, not necessarily. Although I think we will find ourselves doing some of that where we're actually moving species. No, I'm talking about some species that maybe grow on the site or could grow on the site, but are not currently present in the stand. For example, Western white pine. Much of the Douglas fir region, Western white pine is a very suitable species. Might be Western red cedar. It might be noble fir, just depending on the site that you're on. So, no, I'm thinking primarily of species that are not represented adequately on the site that are suitable for the site, even though they're not currently present there. Because diversification of the forest in terms of composition is something that you want to do in this century. You don't want to just plant Douglas fir. You want a mixture of species, including, and you and I have talked about this, including hardwoods. We need to be incorporating particularly deciduous hardwood species in our managed forests. They do a lot of good stuff.
Thank you. Here's one. You mentioned that several million acres of mature and old growth forests were not included in the Northwest Forest Plan, late successional reserves. Can you say more about how you would address these mature and old growth forests in the plan as it's revised?
If we revise the plan, essentially what I would propose is that we set aside all stands of mature and old trees in the Douglas fir region, okay? And so essentially, all of those stands that are currently outside of late successional reserves would be reserved. Furthermore, any individual or small clusters of mature and old trees would also be left whenever they were encountered in a logging operation, for example, or in a restoration of a landscape. So that's what I do, but I would also probably compensate in part for that by eliminating some of the plantations that are currently embedded in the late successional reserves. So I think it's not just a one-way proposition. we could probably eliminate some of the previously harvested forests that got captured in the late successional reserves.
Okay, so here's another one. And I think this stemmed from the observation that there's a lot of mortality in Western red cedar going on in both in understory trees and in overstory trees. Does cedar have a place in the future of Western forests? The older trees seem to be very stressed.
I would say it very much has a place in our forest, and by no means are we going to lose all the Western red cedar. It just depends on the site. And I think there are some sites where Western red cedar is marginal, but I think the vast majority of the Western red cedar is in environments where it's going to persist because it will have good moisture conditions. So the species that's actually more sensitive than Western red cedar is Western hemlock. And we are losing a lot of Western hemlock. And that's because Western hemlock is very sensitive to high atmospheric moisture stress. So a hot, dry summer is a real problem for Western hemlock. And we see in many locations, Western hemlock declining, doesn't die in 1 year usually, it goes into decline and then ultimately dies. And so I think one of our more sensitive species under the warmer, drier climates is going to be Western hemlock, more so than Western red cedar.
So so both cedar and hemlock are important, understory trees for regeneration, then
Yes.
do you think some intervention is needed for if this pattern continues?
Well, I'm not sure what we can do. In fact, for example, for Western hemlock and some of the places we're losing it, I don't think there's anything that we could do that will enable it to persist in some of the locations. It's not going to have a problem close to the coast, the very moistest parts of the region, but I think where it's on drier sites, I think, we're just going to have to accept the fact that it's no longer a suitable species. Red cedar, on the other hand, has an ability to tolerate hot, dry summers, provided it's got its roots in water. And so it's more tolerant than the Western hemlock is of summer drought. But we'll probably lose it from some places as well.
So here's a more general question, just to make sure everybody's on board. How would you define mature and old growth forests? We've been talking about that all day.
Well, what I'm talking about, what Norm Johnson and I have been lobbying for, are naturally regenerated mature and old forests. Forests that originated on their own after a disturbance event, a fire, and have essentially grown through their lifespan without human interference. Okay, and typically the young forest moves into the mature category at about 100 years, plus or minus 20 years. So mature forests are forests that are 100 to 200, 225 years old. And then they move into the young old growth category. So naturally regenerated mature and old would be everything over 100 years in age that originated not following logging, but in fact following fire or windstorm or something of that sort.
I know you've actually written on defining old growth forests, and is there an ecological component besides just age?
It absolutely has to do with more than just age, although age is critical because old trees are an essential part of an old growth Douglas fir forest. So, you have to have some of those in there, and it takes 200, 250 years to grow an old growth tree. So there is an age element to it, but there's a lot more to it than just that. The old growth forest has a totally different structure than the young forest has. And it isn't just that it has bigger trees, but it's tremendously diverse. So it has a lot of heterogeneity. Now, our plantations are very homogeneous. They're very uniform in terms of the pieces, the trees, and the way they're arranged. Space to grow and none to waste was the old forester's desired condition. Well, in the old growth forest, we have a very complex, spatially complex structures with canopy gaps in some places and very heavily shaded areas in others. So we have a horizontal complexity, and then we have a canopy that goes from the ground all the way up to the top of the tallest tree. It's continuous, and so we have a lot of richness and complexity in the horizontal dimension, pardon me, the vertical dimension as well. And so the old growth forest has a lot of structural features that distinguish it. And heterogeneity, diversity, non-uniformity is profound, as well as the big pieces. The big living tree, the big log, the big standing dead tree, the snag.
Jim, how about one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
So as it gets drier on the west side and hotter, as because of climate change, do you see the fire regime of west side forests beginning to change in a material way that would change any management strategies in the future?
Well, we've got a real problem on the west side. We've got a really productive forest. Now, the old forester would have said that's not a problem. The trees grow really fast. And the problem is that the west side Douglas fir forests are forests that are just extraordinarily productive. And what that means is there's always a lot of fuel there. There's always a lot of fuel there. And so fuel is never limiting to fire. And if you tried to make it limiting, if you tried to reduce the fuel loadings in these forests, you end up with something that's totally unnatural and isn't our Douglas fir hemlock forest at all anymore. It's some novel thing that never existed in the past. So you can't have an effective program outside of the urban interface where you're trying to reduce fuels enough to make a difference in terms of how fires behave. So we just have to accept the fact that the west side forests are always going to have a lot of fuel. Now, when we get into a problem is when we get the hot, dry east wind. All of the big fires, all of the major fires, and this was true 2 years ago here in Oregon, happen on a hot, dry east wind event. And if you have an ignition, a fire that's already out there, and an east wind comes up, you've got a real problem on your hand, because that's when the fires pick up and take off. And so one of the things that, and this is going to really surprise some people, but one of the things we can do in the Douglas fir region is have a very aggressive program of detecting and suppressing fire, so that when the east wind comes, we don't have a bunch of fires out there that have that potential to take off. Okay. And so That's one of the ways that we can deal with the problem, but there's no way that we can escape the reality that there are going to be times when we're going to get these big fire events on the west side. It is the nature of the beast. And we just have to recognize that and adapt to it as a society. So.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. Well, I have just a couple of questions to wrap up.
Sure.
And the first would be, is there a question that you have not been asked tonight that you had hoped would have been asked? And how would you answer that?
No, I think we've done pretty well at hitting all the topics I wanted to be sure that we hit. But let me just look here. Restoration, West Side. Yeah, no, I think we've covered it all in terms of things that I want. I do want people to be aware that, you know, we're going to have some real issues trying to figure out what to do about the barred owl. That's going to be a big challenge for us. I think we are going to have to really adopt an attitude of collaborating with nature, and the whole notion that you can just walk away from a forest and leave nature to take care of the problems that we've created is nonsense. You know, this is, as Spock would put it, you know, this is not logical that we would change everything about these forests and the landscapes and the climate and then leave it to nature to adapt to that. Well, nature will do it, but we won't like the outcome. And so we need to be working with these forest systems in a very collaborative session, in a very collaborative way, not just collaboration between humans, but humans with the forest system to produce as acceptable outcomes as we can possibly get under the challenge of climate change. You know, we really need to be doing that. So
I love
thank
it when
you for the
people,
opportunity.
oh, sure. I love it when people quote Spock. Another appropriate Spock quote would be, "We must perform admirably."
That's a good one. But,
And then just two other questions. Tell us about what projects you're working on currently.
well, currently, you know, I'm working on a lot on how should we manage Douglas fir forest? How should we be managing managed forests in the Douglas fir region, given that we want them to be providing a full array of ecological values, and we also want them to be very adaptive in terms of climate change and resistant in terms of fire. So we know now that certainly on the public lands, we're not going to repeat the 20th century clear-cut, burn, and plant a Douglas fir plantation. But we are going to be managing those forests. And so how should we be managing them so that we're getting this array of ecological, economic, and cultural benefits from them, but are also essentially adapting them to climate change? In other words, what kind of silvicultural system do we replace the old clear-cut and plantation with? What kind of managed forest are we going to replace them with? So that's one of the things that I'm spending a lot of time these days thinking about and working with other people on. Yeah.
Do you want to plug any book projects or other commercial ventures?
No, I think the other thing that I think we really, you know, I haven't really begun to do a lot about yet, but we really need to find a way for the old industrial forest lands to do better at providing for other values. And again, as I indicated, you know, most of them are managed today for return on capital. And somehow we as a society need to find ways by which the management in those lands is altered in a way that provide more of the other social benefits that we want, including carbon sequestration, because these are the most productive forest lands we have in the United States, and you could argue in the world. And they need to be doing more for society than they're doing under the current management regimes. So that I see as a really big issue that I'm going to be thinking about a lot.
Excellent. Well, Jerry, I think we'll wrap up. I did want to thank you on behalf of the Washington Native Plant Society, Van Bobbitt, Denise, and all of our members, the Native Plant Society. Thank you for your contributions tonight and for your gracious sharing of time and for your profound contributions to ecosystem science and ecosystem management. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for giving me a chance to talk to you. I really enjoyed it.
And I want to thank Van and Denise for all the background work, and to Jim Erkman for his assistance tonight. So I think with this, we're going to wrap it up, say goodnight, and we'll see you next time.
You betcha.